This year, we've heard a lot about race, justice, and the divisions in our country. But tonight, we are exploring a problem right in our own backyard, a physical divide that splits Dallas in two. We're talking about I-30. It divides people with the most money from people with the least. One way to fix that is more access to banks. But David Schechter found some banks are carving a large part of Dallas out of the service area.
Interstate 30. So many people drive east, west, north, and south of it, you might not even realize how it carves Dallas in two. I-30 is also the line that largely separates financial opportunity in the north from financial barriers in the south. Why is that? Well, we have found new evidence of practices that exclude Black and Hispanic residents from getting bank loans below I-30.
Petrie says he went to Houston to get financing for his business after 7 local banks and savings and loans turned him down. He sees his problems as typical, wanting to expand, but getting little or no support from financial institutions.
In this community, it's an economic embargo. We wouldn't have a housing problem. We wouldn't have an unemployment problem. We wouldn't have a police problem.
That was 32 years ago. And today, car wholesaler Robert Petrie is still in business at that same location in South Dallas.
The things that you talked about in '88, is anything better? It's all pretty much the same?
I would say worse.
Today, Petrie also owns 132 acres of land, including a large event center called Skyline Ranch. He says all of that comes despite a lack of access to bank loans below I-30.
They feel that, hey, the black community, blacks don't deserve opportunities. So we're going to deny them now.
But they're not just sitting around like saying that, right, in their boardroom,
well,
are they?
there are ways, yeah, because they underestimate what we can do as a people.
Above I-30, there's a high concentration of white people and upper-income neighborhoods. South of 30 is mostly Black and Hispanic people, with 38% of residents living below the poverty line.
This area over here is the corner of the Dallas North Tollway and Northwest Highway. And there are just banks all over the place. There's a bank over there.
There are 31 bank branches packed into this corner, while in all of southern Dallas, there are just 58 bank branches in total. Above I-30, across Dallas County, there are 474 bank branches. The city has a long history of excluding blacks from bank loans. It's called redlining. Check out this map from 1937, with red lines drawn around the south side communities that we're talking about. For decades, banks openly denied loans here, particularly to black communities, and the government said it was okay. Then in 1977, Congress attempted to remedy the practice of redlining with the Community Reinvestment Act. The CRA encouraged banks to meet the credit needs of the entire community where they operate. Under the CRA, each bank draws an assessment area map, which basically outlines where it does business. And the law says a map must contain entire counties, cities, or towns, and it cannot arbitrarily exclude low or moderate income geographies. But the CRA recognized some banks might not be able to serve an entire community, and in that case, they could use something like a highway to draw a boundary, as long as that new map does not illegally discriminate. So our team asked every bank in Dallas County, 105 of them, to provide us with their assessment area maps, the area where they do business. And what we found is that 20% of the banks in Dallas County draw maps that exclude all or parts of southern Dallas.
So the opportunity is there for any bank. If you want to make a committed effort to be part of this community, to be part of the effort, I think it's here.
James McGee was a compliance manager who used to help banks follow the rules of the CRA. Now he advocates for greater reinvestment below I-30 as president of the nonprofit Southern Dallas Progress.
So when they draw those kind of maps, is that discrimination?
I think it's discrimination because you look at the demographic of people and where they're located and you're excluding them. I think it is discrimination.
Here are some examples of what we found. Dallas Capital Bank has a single branch in Dallas County near the tollway and 635. From this location, Dallas Capital provides services to all of Denton County and half of Collin County, but covers virtually nothing in Dallas County below I-30. Dallas Capital Bank has declined to comment for this story. Benchmark Bank has 3 branches at Preston and Royal, Hillcrest and Lovers Lane, and McKinney Avenue, just 2 miles north of I-30. Benchmark drew a map that extends north into portions of Denton and Collin counties and picks up parts of Dallas's affluent Kessler Park and Bishop Arts neighborhoods in Oak Cliff, but little else below I-30. Benchmark says all areas conform to CRA regulatory requirements. There's also Interbank. Its 2 Dallas County branches are located at 75 and Mockingbird and the tollway at Lovers Lane. From these branches, Interbank drew a map that excludes virtually everything south of I-30. To the south of Dallas County, Interbank also has branches in Ellis County, and one of them is just 2 miles from the Dallas County line. Interbank serves all of Ellis County, Erath, Somerville, Hood, Parker, and Tarrant counties, but only half of Dallas County. Interbank declined multiple requests for a comment, but in its most recent bank examination, regulators said no evidence of discrimination was identified.
Why do you think it looks like that map?
Oh, they made a conscious effort to create it like that. And that's going to be a senior management decision that's, particularly, doing that and okaying it. And it's additionally signed off by the regulators.
Banks with maps that include all of Dallas County make 48% of their loans to whites, 22% to Hispanics, and 7% to blacks. Those numbers don't total 100% because not all borrowers report race data. But by comparison, we found banks that exclude Dallas below I-30 lend 45% to whites, 8% to Hispanics, and 2% to blacks. What about bank regulators, the people who grade banks every few years on how well they serve low-income communities? Well, regulators give passing grades to banks 98% of the time based on the exams that we saw. And James says that's happening because regulators don't scrutinize how the banks are drawn. They just grade the banks on what happens inside their maps.
It has to be judged harder by the regulator. If we're in school and every class passes, I think it's something wrong with the test. And I think outside of that, the banks are going to be hard inclined to possibly improve their current strategy. Because it's working and they're passing their exams.
3 different government agencies work together to evaluate banks. The Federal Reserve Bank declined to comment for this story, but it's proposing rule changes to modernize regulations because of weaknesses in the Community Reinvestment Act. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, says if our examiners identify a pattern or practice of discrimination at an institution, the case is referred to the Department of Justice for appropriate action. And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, regulates big national banks. The OCC has a new rule requiring that assessment areas be no smaller than a whole county.
So what can the regulators do?
Well, what we're going to do, we're going to make them do their jobs. We're going to force them to do their jobs, and we're going to force the banks to make loans in our community.
None of what you've just seen surprises Robert Petrie at all. He's been discouraged by banks his entire life, and just this January, he sued one. Petrie claimed because he's black, a loan officer quoted him outrageous terms to make him go away.
See, a lot of the things that's happening that's negative in the black community has been by design. And there are forces that have designed these problems that we face, and that's racism.
I think the time has come to bring to bear the power of the nonviolent direct action movement on the basic economic conditions that we face all over the country.
Economic justice is not about charity. It's about opportunity to borrow money, pay it back, and participate in the larger economy. But on the road to opportunity, unlike any other highway in Dallas County, only I-30 seems to get in the way. I'm David Schechter reporting.
We want to know your thoughts about this. David is on Twitter right now, and you can tweet him with the hashtag #BankingBelow30.
Let's get to a follow-up now from a WFAA investigation. Recently, we explored how minority communities in Dallas are denied access to bank loans. Under a law called the Community Reinvestment Act, or the CRA, banks are supposed to meet the credit needs of the entire community. But what we found is 20% of banks in Dallas County draw maps that exclude all or parts of southern Dallas. Zoe Amani works for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which is helping to organize citizens in Dallas to use the CRA to get better access to bank loans.
We educate these community groups about what the CRA is, what it isn't, how it can be used as a tool to build better relationships with financial institutions. And I tell the members of our coalition, our burgeoning coalition, all the time that the CRA is a key to open up the door for better relationships with financial institutions. And thus far, we've contacted a few banks, and one in particular, we developed a CRA comment letter, and the bank got back to the group immediately. And we're looking forward to meeting with this financial institution early in 2021. And I think that's just great for the group to get the ball rolling, because this is an area that has historically been underserved. And if anything, this current moment just should permit everyone to take financial services in areas of concentrated poverty a little bit more seriously.
Do you think it's possible to get more credit flowing from these major banks that operate in Dallas County to the communities that really haven't had access to it?
I think it's possible, and I'll just share this with you. I do think financial institutions generally want to, build better communities, vibrant communities, especially in this current moment. And I also think that community groups and individuals, concerned citizens in communities that have been historically underserved, want the same thing. But what we try to do is essentially match these two interests together, because sometimes these groups, these specific entities are talking past each other, or they don't even know each other. And that's why the CRA is so important. It's important because we want to empower community groups so they can have better relationships with financial institutions. So as things evolve in particular communities, banks, financial institutions, and community groups, they're already interlocked. They already have some sort of familiarity with each other, and they're already excited to work together.
The thing that I have learned is that the Community Reinvestment Act is kind of like a knife, and you can cut something with it. It's a tool you can do something with, but if you just leave it on the table, it doesn't do anything. And so people have to pick up the tool and try to use it to get change.
You hit the nail on the head. Community group mobilization is the heart and soul of CRA. It is up to the community groups and concerned citizens to hold banks accountable in addition to the regulators, and not in an adversarial manner, but it's just an important part of being a member of a community. Of course, you can vote, in elections, but also I would hope that people in communities know that they can comment on a CRA public file. They can communicate with banks about what these banks are doing or not doing in their communities.
So if people want to get involved in this effort, they want to be part of the solution, what can they do?
So if people want to get involved in this effort, they can contact us at NCRC. My email is zamani@ncrc.org. And I think people should join because it enhances their access to critical issues facing their communities. We allow data, we do training, we have this expertise, and we want to strengthen their collective voice. We want to influence local business practices and national policy, and we want to champion fairness and fight discrimination in lending and housing and business. And we want to bring those resources back to the community.
In response to a WFAA investigation, congressional leaders in Dallas will hold hearings to address the lack of access to bank loans in minority communities. It's a critical problem that makes it difficult to buy a home, build a business, and accumulate wealth. Here's David Schechter.
The intersection of yesterday and today. It's a good place to stand back and notice just how slow going the journey has been toward economic justice.
We still struggle to this day to get the government to do what they're supposed to do.
Kevin Felder is the president of the Dallas chapter of the NAACP and a former Dallas council member. He's one of many people demanding change after our recent investigation, which found some banks deny service to minority and low-income communities below I-30 in Dallas.
I believe that this is going to be a starter of a conversation that is long overdue.
Here's a recap of what we found. Above I-30, there's a high concentration of white people in upper-income neighborhoods. South of 30 is mostly Black and Hispanic people, with 38% of residents living below the poverty line. Under a law called the Community Reinvestment Act, or the CRA, banks are supposed to meet the credit needs of the entire community. So we asked every bank in Dallas County, 105 of them, to provide us with their service area maps, the area where they do business. What we found is 20% of banks in Dallas County draw maps that exclude all or parts of southern Dallas. For example, Interbank serves all of Ellis County, Erath, Somervell, Hood, Parker, and Tarrant counties, but only half of Dallas County. Interbank declined multiple requests for a comment, but in its most recent bank examination, regulators said no evidence of discrimination was identified. And when it comes to bank regulators, we found 98% of the time they give local banks a passing grade for how well they serve the needs of low to moderate income communities. So, back to Felder. What does he want?
I'm calling for a congressional hearing here in the city of Dallas to put a spotlight on lending institutions that do not lend south of I-30 the way that the CRA was intended. But it has to be more than a conversation. There has to be some outcomes. There has to be deliverables. There have to be metrics.
Who would be at the table? Bank executives, federal bank regulators, community and business leaders, city leaders, and at the head, members of Congress.
Any kind of effort that I could be a part of to help that come about, I'm ready and willing.
Democratic Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson represents most of southern Dallas, and she told me early next year she will hold hearings with the intent of improving the flow of credit to southern Dallas.
Financial institutions are in the business to make money. I understand that. But also, it should be something within their goals for fairness and justice for people who are not wealthy.
Representative Mark Vesey, also a Democrat, represents West Dallas and parts of southern Dallas. He says he'll join the effort and writes, "I look forward to working with community leaders and lenders across our region to find solutions to improve access to credit. Financial regulators must work more closely with banks to certify that they are serving low-income and minority communities." And Democratic Representative Colin Allred, whose district is all above I-30, says he's in too. He writes, "I support my colleague, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson's efforts to work with stakeholders to improve access to banking in South Dallas. The long, painful history of redlining and discrimination requires us to work together."
You guys have lit the fuse. Now let's continue with this story until the end.
In Dallas, I'm David Schechter reporting.
So what do you think? What's your opinion? David is on Twitter right now, and he wants to hear from you. Use the hashtag BankingBelow30 to share your thoughts with him in a tweet. A longtime Dallas leader is calling for a U.S. Department of Justice investigation after WFAA uncovered a real lack of access to bank loans in minority communities. It's a critical problem that makes it difficult to buy a home, build a business, and accumulate any kind of wealth. Here's David Schechter.
My constituents who are poor, most of whom are African American, my constituents were not represented in a private session, in a closed-door meeting, to, in essence, negotiate the rights of my constituents away.
30 years ago, when Diane Ragsdale served on the Dallas City Council, she did not shy away from a fight.
Nothing but racism.
You didn't cut your lights on for Officer Jones.
You do it. You came up here and stood up here with crack on this lady.
You are a racist, my child.
This is Ragsdale 30 years later, and she's still a fighter. Today, she runs a nonprofit that builds houses in the low-income neighborhood of Mill City, where families can own a new home.
A bank loan can improve people's living conditions. And so you cannot talk about economic justice without bank loans.
Ragsdale wants to see economic justice after WFAA found 20% of banks in Dallas County don't serve the minority and low-income communities that live below I-30. She says it's time for the United States Department of Justice to investigate what's happening here.
Every element that's involved in this must realize that you will be held accountable.
The Community Reinvestment Act is a civil rights law that encourages banks to meet the credit needs of the entire community where they operate. The law requires banks to draw an assessment area map, the area where a bank does business, and the maps cannot arbitrarily exclude low to moderate income areas. But we found examples like this. A Dallas bank with just one branch provides services all the way up into Denton County and half of Collin County, but covers virtually nothing below I-30, an area that's overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic. And this bank's assessment map shows coverage to all of Ellis County, Erath, Somervell, Hood, Parker, and Tarrant counties, but excludes the lower half of Dallas, again, where most residents are minorities. And finally, we found when bank regulators looked at these maps and others, they did not identify any evidence of discrimination. Ragsdale says bank regulators have failed to hold banks accountable, and that's why the Department of Justice is needed.
So when the regulators are failing, what is the role of the Department of Justice?
The Department of Justice has to intervene legally and require measurable outcomes themselves. They have to override the regulators. They have to say, excuse me, you're not doing your job.
And there's precedent for that. In 2016, the Justice Department sued Bancorp South in Memphis. One piece of evidence was the bank's assessment area. At the time, it included 4 whole counties, but like a horseshoe, it excluded nearly every neighborhood in Memphis where the residents are mostly or almost all minorities. The feds said the map was evidence that the bank engaged in unlawful discrimination. Bancorp South reached a $10.6 million settlement with the government, which included $4 million in loan subsidies for minority borrowers and $800,000 to build stronger connections to the minority community. In 2018, the Justice Department sued Klein Bank of Minnesota, and again, a piece of evidence was its horseshoe-shaped map that included the majority white suburbs but excluded the high minority populations of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The bank protested about unprecedented reach by the government, but agreed to a 3-year settlement which included opening a bank branch in a high minority neighborhood and spending $1.8 million on marketing, outreach, and affordable loans to the minority community. Nikitra Bailey leads fair lending policy reform efforts at the nonprofit Center for Responsible Lending in Washington, D.C.
Why are maps considered to be important pieces of evidence in these cases?
The maps tell us who the banks are actually extending credit to, and it's really important to look at them and evaluate them to see if they are meeting their fair lending obligations.
Are these homes, is this street a look at what might be if there was more capital?
Well, yes, this is only one small example of what could happen.
An outside investigation. It's what Ragsdale wants. But it's not the only thing. She says community groups have to get well organized and well funded to fight for their equal right to credit.
Redlining is consistent. And our movement against redlining cannot be inconsistent.
In Dallas, I'm David Schechter reporting.
A senior member of the powerful U.S. House Finance Committee, Representative Al Green, a Democrat from Houston, says he intends to explore the findings of our investigation in Washington. You want to chat with David about this story? You can join him on Twitter right now using the hashtag #BankingBelow30.